Welcome back to AZ 500 series, and today we are going to cover Azure AD hybrid identities. This is the next topic in the syllabus. So what we're going to cover here, first of all, in this slide, we're going to talk about introduction of Azure AD hybrid identity. It's more or less like what it is. And then Azure AD Connect, of course, we'll talk about what Azure AD Connect as well, but it is more like how you achieve the hybrid identities there. All right, so we can understand this with this idea because most organizations are not starting from nothing when they adopt Azure. They already have an identity solution such as Active Directory Domain Services or Windows AD on premises to manage identity and access for existing applications, right? So what it means, this is not if you are born in the cloud. This is more like when you have some identities running somewhere, only then this comes into the picture. So as it is not an effective strategy to maintain multiple independent silos of user credentials, how should such organizations approach their adoption of Azure and Azure Active Directory? That is the question that we are answering in this video. Hybrid identities with the help of a tool provided by Azure, which is Azure AD Connect. Because the whole theme of cloud security is identity centric, and we do not want our users to have multiple identities and multiple passwords and multiple providers. It should be maintained from one central location so that it would be governed and managed and controlled as per the requirement. So, what is Azure AD Connect? It is a tool that can be used to sync objects such as user accounts and groups from on-premises Active Directory Domain Services to Azure Active Directory. It can be installed on-premises on any domain-joined Windows Server 2012 or later system. Once deployed and configured, on-prem ADDS becomes the source of truth for digital identities in the organization, because identities are flowing from here to Active Directory. There are multiple ways we'll see, because sometimes we can also sync the passwords, right? We'll see that in the upcoming slides. So what this means is that users, groups, and contact objects in on-premises ADDS are automatically synced to Azure AD once this is configured properly. This allows us to centralize digital identity provisioning and management for security reasons, of course. That's the AZ 500. So what we all achieve when new objects will create on premises, it will automatically sync in Azure AD. When those objects are disabled on premises, they will automatically disable in Azure AD through sync. Yeah? When those objects are deleted on premises, they are automatically deleted in the Azure AD. When the attributes of those objects are modified on premises, the modifications are automatically applied in Azure AD. It is important to clarify that when we use the term objects in relation to Azure AD Connect Sync, this only applies to user, group, and contact objects. Azure AD, not the Azure, but the on-prem ADDS have multiple things going on, right? We learned in the very first chapter, this and this are not the same, right? So the only objects that can be synced is user, group, and contact objects. For example, computer objects or shared folder objects in on-prem ADDS are not synchronized to Azure AD. We can also configure the scope of synchronization based on domains, OUs, group membership, or attribute values. We'll see that. Apart from synchronizing ADDS objects and their attributes to Azure AD Connect can also facilitate write back. You see here, write back to on-premises ADDS. This opens interesting use cases such as SSPR, self-service password reset, Now, this write back requires license, of course, seems like an advanced capability. So does SSPR. All right, so let's see how to do the installation, or what are the essential steps for the installation of Azure AD Connect. As we said during the introduction of Azure AD, we need to prepare a domain joined Windows Server 2012. Oh, my mistake. It's not 1012, it's 2012 or above on-prem. Only then we can deploy Azure AD Connect tool. Now, apart from this, once like this is your on-premises ADDS, this is another server, domain joined server, where we have installed Azure AD Connect tool. So this is Azure AD Connect server. Now we need two accounts which has the capability to establish the sync. From on-premises side, we need enterprise admin, and from Azure AD side, we need global admin. Okay, and there is one more thing that could be utilized to perform a health check on the on-prem ADDS objects to identify and remediate potential issues that may lead to sync errors later, maybe a tool like Microsoft ID Fix. But that's like conditional, so I have not put it here. So I hope this is clear. These are the essential steps. Now let's see the authentication methods of Azure AD. Because when we implement Azure AD Connect using custom settings, we have the option to choose authentication method, which drives this kind of architecture as per your requirement, of course. There are like three options: password hash sync synchronization, PHS. Then we have federation, which are of two kind, ADFS and ping federate. And then we have pass-through authentication. Now in upcoming slide, we'll talk about each of these methods, their installation, their flow, along with the advantage and disadvantages, which will help us to decide which one to use and what are the trade-offs that we're going to do. Okay. So the very first is PHS, password hash sync, is one of the authentication methods that can implement when we configure hybrid identity using Azure AD Connect. It is the default option. So how do we implement this authentication method? That's the first question. So we know the essential two things that we covered in the previous slide. So we need to install Azure AD Connect on premises, of course, on the prereq fulfilled server. This creates a secure outbound connection between on-premises ADDS and outbound connection and Azure AD. Then we select password hash option and configure the scope of synchronization that identifies the boundary of the object that we want Azure AD Connect to sync to Azure AD, right? We will see all those during the installation, but here just for the understanding. Okay. And in the third step, Azure AD Connect synchronizes the user objects, attributes, and password hashes from an on-premises ADDS instance to Azure AD. It's password hashes. So that's the important point that we need to remember. Passwords are never stored in clear text or encrypted with a reversible algorithm in Azure AD, but are hashed with a strong one-way hashing algorithm such as SHA-256. So what does authentication process looks like for a user when authentication method is implemented? As you can see in the diagram, when an authenticated user tries to access a cloud application, they are redirected to Azure AD. They are redirected to Azure AD. This guy is trying to access cloud app and it is redirected to the Azure AD. The user signs in with the username and password. Azure AD fulfills the authentication request as it has the password has to the user. Of course, with the user object is already there. The user's client receives an access token back and voila, they can use this token to access the cloud application. Now let's see some advantage and disadvantage of password hash synchronization. The main advantage of using this method is that it does not rely on your on-premises infrastructure to fulfill authentication request. Even if the connection between on-prem ADDS and Azure AD and on-prem DDS, if this breaks, even though your users can access cloud applications because Azure AD has both user AD, user object, and password hashes. Another advantage of this method is that we can implement a security feature called leaked credential detection. This is advanced feature for sure. This security feature detects whether your user credentials have been identified in publicly leaked username password pairs, because you have all the hash user ID, and this is the feature of Azure AD. It goes on the blacknet, figure it out, let you know if your credentials belong or out there in the blacknet. I don't think they call it blacknet, but you know what I mean. The main downside of the PHS authentication method is that it does not support on-prem ADDS user level security. That's the big one, yeah. This means that organizations that want to enforce their on-prem ADDS user security and password policies will not be able to do so with this authentication method. This is because authentication requests are not fulfilling on-premises, so those policies cannot be applied. Authentication is happening in the Azure AD because it has username and password both. Also, on-premises MFA server cannot be used with this authentication method. So if an org uses a third-party on-prem MFA server, this will not factor in authentication request. Again, because here is where the authentication is happening. Another downside is that some organization may not be allowed to synchronize password hashes outside of their environment to an infrastructure that is not completely in their control. This is especially true for very highly regulated industries. For those special cases, they may not be able to implement this option. Now, let's see the federation flow. So for those organizations that may not be able to implement PHS, as I said when I was ending the previous slide, due to compliance requirement of password hash storage, an option that they can implement is federation. This option allows organization to configure a trust relationship between their on-premises federation server and Azure AD. Of course, there is a proxy. Okay, you can see this. Yeah. With the federation authentication method, authentication requests are redirected to the on-premises federation server in order to fulfill on-premises. The method currently supports two federation services, as I mentioned in the previous slide, ADFS and Ping Federate, which is another federation service similar to ADFS. So how do we implement this authentication method? Well, again, we know how to install the Azure AD Connect till now. We have server 2012 and above. We have outbound connections established already when we install Azure AD Connect. We select one of the federation option with there are multiple options to select like PHS, PTA, federation, and configure the scope of synchronization, which identifies the boundaries of the object that we want Azure AD Connect to sync, just like in the PHS. Now, Azure AD Connect sync the user objects and attributes from on-premises ADDS instance to Azure AD. Here, we are not synchronizing the password hashes, okay? Only the user identities. So, what does the authentication process look like for a user when authentication method is implemented? When an unauthenticated user tries to access a cloud application, they are redirected to Azure AD sign-in page. Azure AD then redirects the user to the federation sign-in page. The user sign-ins with the user username and password. The federation server fulfills the authentication request on premises. Now here is authentication happening, not here. It will go get it authenticated. So let's see some advantages and disadvantages. Remember, in PHS, authentication was happening in the Azure AD. The main advantage of using this authentication method is that password hashes are not synchronized to Azure AD, which enables certain organizations to fulfill very strict regulatory requirements or compliances. Another advantage of this method is that on-prem ADDS user-level security policies will be applied and on-prem MFA server can be used. This is because authentication requests are fulfilled on premises. Remember, these two were the downside of the PHS. The main downside of this federation authentication method is that it depends on the availability of the on-premises infrastructure. If the on-prem infra experience downtime, no one will be able to authenticate to the cloud or cloud applications. To prevent this, organization end up having a redundant implementation of the federation proxy server and the federation server, which increases the complexity, cost, and the ongoing management overhead of the implementation and management. Another downside of this method is that leaked credential detection security feature cannot be used for hybrid identity, as Azure AD doesn't know or doesn't have the user password hashes. So yeah, these are the trade-offs. You need to figure out what is exact requirement and then fulfill with one of these authentication methods. And the last but not the least is pass-through authentication, which is very interesting. PTA is another option that can be implemented by organizations that have a compliance requirement to keep password hash storage in-house, but no need to create another whole infrastructure like we were doing in Federation, ADFS. This is achieved using a lightweight agent that can be installed on one or more on-premises servers. It can even be installed on the same server that Azure AD Connect is installed on. So how do we implement this authentication method? Again, the steps would remain almost the same. We install Azure AD Connect on premises, secure outbound connection between on-prem ADDS and Azure AD. We select PT option out of all the options that we have. We can choose to sync. Then, of course, the scope of synchronization. Then Azure AD Connect synchronizes the user object and attributes from an on-prem AD DS instance to Azure AD. Passwords are not synchronized here again. And check this diagram for the flow. When an unauthenticated user tries to access the cloud application, they are redirected to Azure AD sign-in. The user sign in with the username and password. Azure AD collects the user's authentication information, encrypts the password using the public key of the on-premises authentication agent, and temporarily plays in the queue right here. Okay. An on-premises PT agent retrieves the username and encrypted password from the queue over a pre-established persistent connection. See, it is not throwing in, the connection is not going in, but the agent is going out and picking information from the queue and coming back in. This is, again, this can make your security team happy. You're not asking for inbound connection, only outbound. Now, the agent then decrypts the password by using its private key. The agent validates the username and password against an on-premises AD. The agent returns the authentication response back to Azure AD, and voila. PT allows us to keep our password hashes on premises without the management overhead of ADFS, Federation Services. However, it still has the disadvantage of relying on customer infrastructure. What you will usually see that customer use PTA as their primary option with PHS as a backup option. Disaster recovery. I hope this helped. We covered a lot, and thank you for watching, and you guys have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.